Before we get started for our first speaker, I would like to thank the MASH Brass Ensemble for coming down to play today and the representatives from the Mashapella. I'm sorry. So thank you so much for coming down, and I'm glad that you're staying a little while this morning with us, so thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Abe Fenton, who is going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. Our speaker today, Dr. Richard W. Turk, graduated from Flint, Michigan Central High School in 1956. He went on to Albion College, graduating magna cum laude with Phi Beta Kappa honors in 1960. Receiving the National Defense Act three-year fellowship for graduate studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He received his Master of Arts degree in 1961 and his PhD in 1968. From 1968 to 2006, he was professor of history at Allegheny College, where he taught a wide range of history courses with a number of naval and maritime courses, two of which were a history of the maritime empires 1480 to 1945, covering Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, England, and the United States, and a popular seminar, World War II at Sea, both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. A published author with his book, The Ambiguous Relationships, Theodore Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Maha, 1987. He also wrote numerous articles and essays appearing in professional journals. A few months ago, I received a commemorative coin from a veterans organization. The front of the coin depicts two of our carrier-based dive bombers flying over a burning Japanese aircraft carrier with the dates June 4th to June 7th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. The verse says, 80th anniversary victory at Midway, and the following quote, they had no right to win, yet they did, and in doing, they changed the course of the war. What it doesn't say, other things changed too, because of the victory at Midway. And here to tell us more about that Battle of Midway is my friend, Dr. Richard Turk. Dick?
Good morning. I'd like to say that I ordered up the rain since we're dealing with the Pacific and naval issues this morning, but I was not responsible. Before I get into this, I'm going to be providing some background material which I think is useful to keep in mind as we go along. And one point I would like you to have is the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. What it did, among other things, was to announce that there's a new kid on the block in the person of Japan as an East Asian power. Secondly, during World War I, Japan was on the side of the Allies. And among other things, that meant that at the end of the war, Germany's Pacific Island possessions north of the equator were given over to Japan as mandates under the League of Nations. South of the equator, they were given to Great Britain or Britain's dominions, Australia, and New Zealand. Third point, the Washington naval treaties. Now, this is a subject in itself, but all we need to know is that the purpose of these was to avoid a fresh naval arms race such as had occurred prior to the First World War. And it specified that Great Britain and the United States could have parity as far as their capital ships and major warships were concerned, because each was basically a two-ocean navy. You could say Britain's naval interests were even global. Japan, the other large naval power at the time, was given a 60% ratio as far as her naval vessels were concerned, large ships. And if you just keep in mind 553, that will help you understand that the Japanese, needing naval forces in the Western Pacific at any rate, were not given parity with the other two powers, and in time that created some problems itself. Finally, fourth thing to keep in mind, war plans. I want to say a few words about the U.S. Navy's war plans involving Japan. Some of you may know this as War Plan Orange, because all of the war plans were given color designations. So War Plan Orange, in its simplest fashion, assumes that we have gone to war with Japan. It assumes that the Japanese have taken control of the Philippine Islands, which were a U.S. possession. And it posits the relief of the Philippines by sending the U.S. fleet across the Pacific to relieve the situation in the Philippines, and it assumes a major fleet engagement between Japanese and American naval forces in the Western Pacific. Now, given the 5-to-3 ratio, then the assumption would further be that the United States in most circumstances should win such an engagement and be able to then win a conflict with Japan in the Pacific. But now Japan, among other things, has some of those additional island groups in the Pacific, the Central Pacific area, where the fleet would be going. So it immediately creates some additional problems along that line. So I just want you to keep some of these things in mind as we go along. Now, war breaks out December 1941. We all know about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. What I'd like you to recall is the Russo-Japanese War I mentioned earlier. That war began by a Japanese naval attack on Russian forces at a place called Port Arthur in southern Manchuria. So you might say it's another case of, if you do not learn from history, you may be repeating it. I'm not going to be talking in any detail about Japanese conquests in East Asia, the Western Pacific, Southeast Asia during the first 3 months of the war. In fact, it went far better than the Japanese themselves anticipated. They assumed it might take up to 6 months in order to achieve their aims. So we need to begin with the Japanese Navy deciding, in effect, okay, what do we do now? We're in March of 1942. What, in effect, was going to happen is that they were considering various alternatives. For example, should they consider invading Australia? It would have been feasible to do so. They could have made landings almost anywhere on Australia's northern coast at this time. Another possibility might be to engage in an attack on British Ceylon, south of India. It's an island. It's fairly close to the Indian subcontinent. It could lead on to further troubles for the British in India. And another option would be an attack on a place in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia, called Port Moresby. And this is going to play a role, actually, as we shall see, in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which I'm going to be talking briefly about in a few moments. You could even make a case, and some in the Japanese Navy did, maybe we need to pay a return visit to the Hawaiian Islands. If they could capture Oahu or the Hawaiian Islands, then it might be time for the United States to basically throw up its hands and say, look, we're not going to get anywhere in this war in the Pacific. We'd better negotiate. We'd better consider some kind of settlement. So all of these things are possibilities. And yet another possibility, because the Japanese knew that we were able to use Australia much as we were using Britain in the war in the Atlantic as a base from which attacks can be made. In the case of Europe, of course, Germany. In the case of the Pacific War, Japan. So Australia is an island bastion, potentially, and an area where we can build up our forces. So anything that the Japanese could do to neutralize Australia or to sever our communications from the Hawaiian Islands and the U.S. West Coast with Australia and New Zealand. This was a vital line of supply and reinforcement. And if the Japanese moved south and east, they were potentially able to sever some of our communications, and we, the U.S. Navy, was extremely concerned that they might just do that. Okay. There's a major planning conference in Japan, in Tokyo, April 2 through April 5 of 1942. And a number of these options were thrashed out at the time. Now, one of the problems from a naval point of view, going to Australia, say, going to Ceylon, even considering an attack on the Hawaiian Islands, the Army, the Japanese Army, flatly refused to provide the forces that would have been necessary for such operations. But if not the Hawaiian Islands, then possibly Midway is being talked about as a source of attack. Now, Midway, as you should know, is a little over 1,100 miles north and west of Oahu. It's at the end of a long chain of atolls or sunken atolls. 1,100 miles. That ain't close. So you might ask, why the focus on Midway from the Japanese point of view, or from some of the Japanese naval people? It creates its own problems. That's what I'm trying to suggest. So if you're thinking of attacking the Hawaiian Islands or even Midway, think about this. It is going to mean an awful strain on Japanese logistics, supply, reinforcement, troops, food. I mean, the whole range of supplies. A second thing to keep in mind, and a second objection to moving into the Central Pacific, is that the Japanese carrier force that had swept everything before it, heretofore in the war, the Japanese carrier force was in serious need of refit and replenishment. They were worn out. A third factor, if the Navy moved into the Central Pacific, they would not have the advantage of any land-based reconnaissance. They had to depend entirely upon the Japanese carrier fleet air. And two more objections, and I'm stressing these because these are objections that the Japanese themselves raised. We're talking April 1942, remember. Midway itself represented little value to Japan. Midway itself, let me repeat, represented little value to Japan. Okay, suppose they take it. Suppose they hold it. They might have a radius of planes based there which could go out 600-700 miles, but this would not prevent the Americans from sending their forces either side and outside of the range of Japanese forces. It certainly is going to mean constant harassment of Midway from the air and from submarines. So think of the replenishment problems, logistic problems that the Japanese would face. So it really doesn't, in some respects, make a lot of sense. So why the emphasis on Midway, and where is it coming from? It's coming from the combined fleet. It's coming from the combined fleet, not the Naval General Staff. And the commander at the time was Yamamoto Isoroku. Now, he was himself a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, and he himself had been at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 when Japanese naval forces destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had come all the way halfway around the world to try to repair the Russian position there. Following that, what happened is that the Japanese asked President Theodore Roosevelt to mediate, to come in and intervene, and what ultimately happened, this was going to lead to negotiation between Japan and Russia and the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. So what Yamamoto sees is the possibility of another Battle of Tsushima, this time in the Central Pacific. If they go out and attack and take Midway, it's going to force the United States fleet out to try to stop this. But given the actual disparity of forces at the time, that's going to be a difficult proposition. So Yamamoto's thinking to himself, well, we're going to be able to basically ruin the rest of the U.S. fleet when they try to stop us, and particularly the American carriers. Now, one last objection which some Japanese were raising to an operation in the Central Pacific. What if the U.S. fleet doesn't take the bait? What if they do not contest the capture of Midway by Japan? What then? Yamamoto is obsessed with the idea of a decisive fleet engagement with U.S. naval forces and figures the attack on Midway is the way to get it. All right. So out of some of these discussions at Imperial General Headquarters, April 25, comes a directive, a headquarters directive on 16 April 1942. That calls for, first, an attack on Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, first week of May 42. Second, Midway and the Aleutians. Midway and the Aleutians, first week in June. And third, the Japanese will then move back to the southeast and capture New Caledonia and Fiji and possibly even American Samoa to sever our communications with Australia and New Zealand. That's the plan. Now, unfortunately, from the planning point of view, at least in part, 2 days later, on 18 April, Doolittle's raid on Japan occurred. B-25 bombers taking off from a carrier flew over Japan, dropped some bombs, went on, given their range, to bases in China that they were able to land and used. So you might say one in the eye for the Japanese, because they didn't want they didn't want, obviously, any attacks on their home island, so it's a black eye for the Navy. And what it is going to do is to almost guarantee that the Midway operation is going to go ahead. There were still some in Japan who hoped to kind of get that off the charts entirely, but it did not work. So the Coral Sea operation takes place May 1, May 8. What we need to know about that is basically two things. Never did surface vessels of either side encounter each other. All of the naval activity was by naval air of each side on the other party. This is going to be characteristic of carrier versus carrier engagements in the war. And the same thing is going to hold true for the Midway operation. Second point. The United States lost the USS Lexington, one of its fleet carriers, and its other vessel in this operation, the Yorktown, was severely damaged. So this is one up to the Japanese. But the Japanese lost a light carrier to American air, and the loss of that light carrier meant that the force that was headed towards Port Moresby by sea decided finally to turn around and go back. And the other thing that happens is that the two Japanese fleet carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, both of them suffered damage, both of them suffered severe attrition of their air fleets, and in consequence, neither would be available to take part in the operation against Midway. So, unlike the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 41, the Japanese used 6 fleet carriers. Midway, they're only going to have 4. All right. Now, we have to get into the realm of naval intelligence, and particularly the interception and deciphering of Japanese radio transmissions. The operative station here was called Station Hypo. And in the military alphabet, when you get to the letter H, hypo is the word used. Able, Baker, Charlie, etc. So this was Station H, or hypo. And its leader was a man called, an officer called Joseph Rochefort. Now, by May of 1942, the Allies were intercepting about 60% of Imperial Japanese Navy radio traffic. Now, that doesn't mean they're reading 60% of it, but they're intercepting 60% of the signals. Shore to ship, ship to ship, whatever. Of that 60%, they might decrypt portions of 40% of the intercepts, and they might break perhaps 10 to 15% of the code groups in those messages. What Station Hypo learned, for example, and I'm basing this on a May 20 intercept. This is after the Coral Sea operation, before Midway. A May 20 intercept was deciphered, broken down, and Rochefort concluded that there was going to be a Japanese carrier air attack on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians on the 3rd of June. There was going to be a carrier air attack on Midway, and it was going to come on the 4th of June. Carriers, Japanese carriers from the northwest on a course 325 degrees will be sighted approximately 175 miles from Midway at 0600 hours. Now you're asking yourself, how could they possibly do this? Well, all praise and glory to the code breakers. I mean, these people were putting in impossibly long hours trying to get at this, and being able to pick up the information. And the next thing that's going to happen is that this is going to have to be sold to the higher-ups, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral King back in Washington, and in essence, that all this is going to be believed and going to be acted on. Now, Rochefort already had predicted what was going to happen in the Coral Sea operation quite accurately. And so this is a person that's going to be listened to. And Nimitz is going to accept some of these assumptions and take action accordingly. And what it's going to mean is the American carriers, and we're talking here Enterprise, Hornet in one group, and the Yorktown, which came back to Pearl and went immediately into dry dock for repairs. But the American carriers would be sent up to take a position north and east of Midway. So you've got Japanese carriers coming in from the northwest. You have American carriers waiting for them in the northeast. You see how this is going to set up? You see how this is going to set up? And how did Rochefort decide that the Japanese were going to attack Midway? Well, he thought that the Japanese were using a designation AF in their code for Midway. And he had the Midway people send out in the clear that their water condenser had broken down. And sure enough, in a couple of days, he picked up a message, AF water condenser has broken down. So the Japanese confirmed it unquestionably. So what I'm emphasizing here is that the intelligence that America was getting and reading and using was absolutely vital. Did the Japanese know that we were doing so well in reading their codes? No. Nor, I should add, did the Germans know that we, the Allies, were deciphering much of their coded transmissions on the Enigma machine. So in both the European and Pacific theaters, decipherment and acting on that information is vitally important. Okay, let's go to Midway itself, the 4th, 5th, 6th of June. The initial contacts with Japanese forces heading for Midway was made, I believe, on the 3rd by an Army bomber or a Catalina. I'm not recalling just which detected a force coming from the Marianas with some troops for invasion purposes. And not long after, they also picked up the Japanese carrier force coming in as Rochefort had suggested. Now, the Japanese have no idea that there are any American naval forces in the vicinity. They assume they're back at Pearl. And by the Japanese standards, what they would hope is that after Japan had struck Midway, possibly also staged its invasion, that then and only then would American naval forces sortie and the Japanese would be ready for them. But it would be a matter of several days lag. So, initial contacts are made with the Japanese carrier striking force, with the invasion force. There are other forces afloat, Japanese main fleet battleships, etc. They're all over the place. Now, the Americans have been advised, take what action you can with your carriers. That's basically all we have. Take what action you can with your carriers. But do not risk your ships without the possibility of inflicting greater damage on the Japanese. So, on schedule, on the 4th, the Japanese launch an aerial assault on Midway. Coming back from that, the assessment is we need another strike on Midway to soften it up before we go in for the landings. So what this is going to mean, among other things, is you've got to land the planes, you have to refuel them, you have to rearm them. You don't do that on the deck. You don't do that on the deck. They have to be taken down on the elevator into the hangar deck, which is where all these operations occur, then brought back up and relaunched. Japanese scouts had gone out on a routine precautionary series of flights all around the clock, so to speak, including the Northeast, which is where the American carrier forces were. Unfortunately, from a Japanese point of view, the discovery of those American forces occurred fairly late in the game on the 4th. And by the time the Japanese were able to recognize that there were American vessels and at least one carrier to the northeast, the Americans had already launched their forces against the Japanese fleet. So there is an element, I would say, of luck in all this, because by the time the Japanese knew and reacted to the presence of American naval vessels and at least one carrier off to the northeast, they were in a position of having to change the armament, because if you're attacking an island and an airfield, that's one thing. You would be using shrapnel, high explosive shells, and so on and so forth. If you think you're going to be attacking ships or enemy carriers, you've got to be using torpedoes. You've got to be using armor-piercing bombs. And the Japanese had the problem of changing how they were loading and refueling these planes, so there were torpedoes and bombs lying all over the place on the hangar deck. You see what I'm saying? of the Japanese carriers. Now, while all these things were going on and before any carrier, U.S. carrier planes had reached the Japanese fleet, B-17s, Marine aircraft, some naval air, they were sending everything they could from Midway and environs to attack the Japanese fleet, all unsuccessfully. All unsuccessfully. Of course, it kept the Japanese on the jump to some degree. But the first carrier planes to reach the Japanese carrier force were torpedo bombers. Now, this is all well and good, but American torpedo bombers at the time were notoriously slow. Difficult for U.S. fighter cover to stay with them. They were on the verge of being retired, and a newer and better model of torpedo craft came in. What I'm suggesting here is there were 3 torpedo group strikes on the Japanese carrier force. In aggregate, 61 torpedo planes went out. None of them got any hits, and only 6 of those 61 ever made it back to their carriers. Only 6. Now, as for the dive bombers, the scout bombers, I think they'd be called, the ones in the arsenal that were capable of doing real damage to the Japanese carriers. One of the carriers groups went off on a heading that they missed Japanese forces entirely. And its leader subsequently never did file a flight report because he was so embarrassed that he had picked a heading that was absolutely wrong for intercepting the fleet. So we're basically down to 2 of the 3 American carrier dive bomber groups. One was about to miss the Japanese carriers to the south, but as they were thinking they were just about going to have to turn around, they spotted a wake of a Japanese destroyer, which had been depth charging an American submarine, and it was heading north and east and was leading this group of dive bombers directly toward the Japanese fleet. So when they found the fleet, most of the Japanese Zeros, the fighter air patrol, were basically down at lower levels because they'd been dealing with the torpedo attacks, and in any cases, some of them might have needed refueling themselves. So there wasn't much over the carriers to prevent the American dive bombers from lining up, going into their dives, taking aim on the Japanese carriers. And as they were doing the bombing and bombing 2 of the 4 Japanese carriers, this would be Kaga and Akagi. The other dive bomber group shows up, and they hit the Hiryu. I'm sorry, the Soryu. They hit the Soryu. So what happens is bombs go down through the deck, into the hangar deck. Remember all the bombs, torpedoes, etc., fuel lines lying around. It's starting raging fires, which the Japanese simply are unable to bring under control in these 3 carriers. Obviously puts them out of operation, but they can't get the fires under control. So now we're down to a point of 1 Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, which is going to send out an attack. They'll find the Yorktown, the damaged but repaired Yorktown, launch an attack on her, inflict further damage, and then there's going to be a second strike from Hiryu, and they again spot the Yorktown, which by now has repaired some of the damage from the first strike, and they think it's a different carrier entirely, but it wasn't. So only the Yorktown was to suffer damage from Japanese naval air during the Battle of Midway. Now, another strike goes out from the American carriers, and this time the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, is struck, and again fires uncontrollable are going to be breaking out on the vessel. So the Japanese have reached the point that they have lost or will lose all 4 of their fleet carriers. So there's a lot of toing and froing and saying, what do we do now, Coach? and basically they make the only decision possible, because they are entirely dependent on carrier air, remember. They're going to have to call the whole thing off. Now, there had been some idea that they might proceed in, and this would be the battleships, cruisers, etc., and take on the American fleet, but the American fleet ain't going to be anywhere where they can be reached. They won't charge in toward Midway or toward the Japanese fleet. They'll pull back in the night of the 4th, 5th. So they'll stay well out of range of any retaliation from Japanese surface units. So ultimately, the Japanese are simply going to have to accept that this has not worked, that they have lost this particular engagement, and decide to pull back. Now, as a coda to this, one of the Japanese cruiser groups had been slated to go in to bombard Midway. This particular operation was called off, and they were in the process of retreating themselves. We're talking here the 5th of June. And as they retreated, they spotted an American sub which had been following them and decided to take evasive action, so they were going to make a sharp turn to starboard. The third vessel in line, the Mikuma, turned too sharply and wound up hitting its sister ship, Mogami, about 100 feet behind the bow, bending the bow of the Mogami at about a 45-degree angle. And consequently, these two damaged vessels were subject to carrier air attack on the 5th and again on the 6th. Mogami somehow managed to limp out of range with further damage. Mikuma, on the other hand, was sunk by the second assault on the 6th. And that basically brought the curtain down on naval action, with one exception. Yorktown, which has been damaged, they've tried to get her under tow. They've managed to put out fires and repair other damage to get her back to Pearl. The problem is that one of those Japanese subs encountered the vessel, that line of Japanese subs that were going to inflict damage on the U.S. fleet if it came out, remember. So a Japanese submarine encountered the Yorktown. It could have been saved had they sent along with the American forces a seagoing tug. They did not, and all attempts to tow Yorktown had basically failed. So there's a U.S. destroyer right alongside her. Japanese sub fires a spread of torpedoes. This damages Yorktown mortally and sends the destroyer, the Hammond, USS Hammond, to the bottom. Okay. To look at the respective losses of each side. We have the Yorktown sunk, the destroyer Hammond sunk by the Japanese sub, 145 aircraft destroyed, and 307 killed. Those are the American casualties. Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 1 other cruiser, that would be Mogami, and several destroyers suffered damage. They lost in total 292 aircraft. 292. and had over 3,000 killed. Some obviously on the carriers, some obviously on crews of the Japanese cruisers. Over 3,000 killed. So it turns into a clear victory for the Navy, and it is certainly a reason to remember Midway. I'm not going to argue that this was a turning point of the war in the Pacific, but it was extremely important because it guarantees that there is going to be no early end to the war in the Pacific. It won't be a short war. And this is crucial as far as the Japanese are concerned, because think of the difference in industrial potential in the two countries. Here you have Japan, a country roughly the size of California, and no matter how hard they work and rebuild ships and the rest of this, they are about 1 to 10 for the United States in terms of its industrial capacity. Now, it's going to take time. It's going to take time, but a long war is one that the Japanese cannot win. They cannot win. Now, let me just make one other comment here. The Japanese lose 4 fleet carriers, yes. But the bulk of the Japanese Navy, is still operative, and even the lost carriers can be eventually replaced. And their replacements would be involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. So, what happened to War Plan Orange? Thought I'd forgotten all about that. War Plan Orange begins to roll late 43, early 44 in the Central Pacific, starting with the Gilbert Islands. Some of you will remember the name Tarawa. Starting in the Gilberts, proceeding to the Marshalls, then jumping all the way to the Marianas in 44. And finally, as War Plan Orange calls for, the Philippines, late 44, early 45. So War Plan Orange, after all, was crucial and did in fact play out. So I think that is a good point for me to end.
Thank you very much, Dick, for your thoughtful presentation. You know, you brought 2 factors to my mind, and I'm sure to the audience's mind: the vastness of the Pacific Ocean and the logistical problem, especially for the Japanese, but for us too.
For us too, we did not really resolve that until late 43, early 44. We took our logistic train with us as we went across the Central Pacific.
And that was the development of what we called in the Navy underweight replenishment. And having been on a carrier I thought, oh, geez, it's going to be great to see launching and recovery of aircraft. And it was. But the thing I enjoyed most was the underway replenishment. When we were out to sea and the cargo ships would come out, they'd shoot a line over with a shotgun-like weapon, and we'd tie up. We'd have a destroyer, maybe a sub or two on one side. We would take fuel and from a tanker. Tankers would come out in the early morning, riding low in the water. At the end of the day, they were high in the water and broke contact and took off. But that key underway replenishment was a way, as you so well pointed out, to our victory in the Pacific. And of course, the event of the Essex-class aircraft carrier
Right,
was
which appears in late 43.
right
In
43.
numbers,
Right.
significant.
And there were, well, I was on number 39, so there were approximately from 20, at least 25.
Yeah.
I forget the number,
I
maybe
think so.
close to 30 of the Essex-class aircraft carriers, which brought another point you brought out so well, the productive capability of the United States compared to the capability of the Japanese. You know, another thing I learned not too many years ago was the Japanese on their ships. On our ships, we ate very well in the messes on the ship, in the officers' wardroom, the warrant officers' wardroom, the chief's mess and all. We ate very well. The Japanese, they issued rations to their crew, and they would go up and on their little, what they call them, hibachis or whatever, they would cook their own food on the decks. Can you imagine a mess on a ship and all? You know, it's mind-boggling, the difference between the navies. But thank you very much for, are there any questions from the audience?
I have one question. Is there a short explanation why the Japanese didn't take Australia when they could have?
The main point is the Japanese Army flatly refused to supply the 5 divisions that the Navy thought would be needed. And that was true for an attack on the Hawaiian Islands. It was true for an attack on Ceylon. The Army had about 1 million troops at the time stationed in Manchuria. Their eye was northward on the Russians, or alternatively on China.
Where were the other 2 Japanese carriers that participated in Pearl Harbor during Midway?
They were the Shokaku and Zuikaku. They had suffered enough damage to air crews and to the vessels themselves that they were unable to participate in the Midway operation. That was Coral Sea.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much, Dick. Appreciate it.